Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Retrospective. We're joined by a very, very special guest today, and it's the man who's quite literally one of the voices of football, Derek Rae. How are you, man?
I'm very well. Nice to be with both of you. We're all on the same boat. I think many people could say that at the moment, given the lockdown. Of course, I'm here in the USA and you guys in the UK, but we're all having to adapt to new circumstances.
Yeah, it's a crazy time at the moment, and we're all coping in our different ways. Me and Hass are just making YouTube videos, so that's all we're doing. If you haven't seen Retrospective before, we should have 4 episodes out by now, so that's pretty cool. And,
Churning them out.
Churning them out, so it's pretty cool. And today we've got a very, very unique and individual guest. So Hass, start us off, mate, with some questions for Derek.
Well, the first sort of part we always go for is your formative years, really. And you know how you found yourself in there. So I've did a bit of background reading, of course, as you should before every interview you ever do. And I read that you actually had an amateur sort of football career before you ventured into media. So tell us a little bit about that, and sort of then how you found yourself entering the media field.
Well, my amateur football career wasn't anything to write home about at all, Hass. It was just kicking the ball around in the playground like everybody else. I'm from Aberdeen originally, in the northeast of Scotland, and used to play a lot, especially in the summer. We'd have these games in the park that would sort of just be impromptu games that would start at 10 o'clock in the morning and they'd still be going at 10 o'clock at night, and people would sort of leave for a couple of hours and then come back and rejoin the game. So I was always very keen on that side of it, played at school, but realised early on that I was never particularly special. Tried very hard, had a good work ethic, but not an awful lot else. But what was happening while that was all going on was I developed, really from 1974 on, I was 7 years of age at that time. From 1974, when the World Cup took place in West Germany, as it was, I became a huge fan of the international dimension of the sport. And concurrent with that was an interest in becoming a broadcaster. Now, I should say in 1974, we as a family bought for the first time, and this is going to sound very strange to guys of your generation, we bought a stereo cassette recorder, which was a very revolutionary device back then, I can tell you. Up until that point, the idea of listening back to your own voice on tape just didn't exist. So all of a sudden you had this tape machine and you could play around with it. And I used to impersonate the commentators and the pundits that I would hear on BBC and ITV during that 1974 World Cup. And I took it on from there and gradually got my own portable version of the same thing. And I would take it out and about and I would commentate on games in the playground. And then I would go to Aberdeen reserve games when I was a bit older, around 11, and commentate on the Aberdeen reserve games, and then eventually to first team games, and so on and so forth. And then eventually I got to the stage where I wanted to do it for a wider audience, and hospital radio was a big thing back then. I don't honestly know if hospital radio is still a thing in the UK. It might be.
Yeah, it is.
I think it is still, yeah.
Yeah, I think it probably is. But back then, if you actually look at broadcasters of my age or older, quite a few of them got their starts with hospital radio because it was a forum for being on the air, talking to an audience, obviously on an amateur basis, but without the pressure of doing it professionally. So I used to do the Aberdeen games for hospital radio, did that all the way until my early university years. And I was 19 when I submitted one of these tapes indirectly to the BBC. I'd been in touch with my great hero, and we can maybe talk about this later on, having a hero who is your role model, who helps you. David Francie was the voice of Scottish football for a generation, for my generation, very distinctive sound to his commentary. And I just one day wrote a letter to him thinking I would never get anything back with one of my tapes. I was, I think, 12 at the time, and got a delightful reply from the great man, going over my tape, pointing out things that I did well, things he thought I could do better. And we sort of stayed in touch. So when I finally submitted a tape back to him when I was 19, I'd been doing it a few times in between time. Instead of sending me back his usual advice, he actually just gave it to his bosses. And it was one of the bosses, Charles Runcie, who called me when I was 19 and said, I kind of like what's on this tape. Could you come down to Glasgow and have a chat about it? And as I said, I was a student at Aberdeen University at the time, went down to Glasgow, and it transpired that a few weeks later, David Francey had a knee injury, couldn't do the game he was meant to do. So I was given my debut for BBC Radio Scotland. And then after that, this is cutting a long story very short, the second game I did on the air was the small matter of England against Scotland at Wembley at the age of 19. So it was an unusual introduction to the top level of radio broadcasting for an entire nation, for Scotland. And I'll never forget it. And I spent 5 years at the BBC thereafter. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but it sort of, brings you the story of how it happened for me. And it was a dream, really, that I was able to realize. And it all stemmed from a love of football, but also a love of words and a love of broadcasting.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned, obviously, the knee injury moment. I was actually reading about that as well. It's quite like a lightning strikes kind of moment, isn't it, really? And it's quite a unique way to find yourself in that position. I bet you would never have imagined it happening like that.
Not at all, because actually one of the other bosses at the BBC in Glasgow did a newspaper piece answering questions about my meteoric rise at the age of 19. And he said it really was, something unheard of. He said it was a bit like, if you think of a musical in the West End or something like that, if you think of, somebody who was in the chorus line suddenly getting to be the lead voice in a musical, he said, it's a bit like that. He said, but actually it's not like that. He said, because until last week, Derek wasn't even in the chorus line. So
yeah, it really is a step forward. Really
I was very lucky. And we'll perhaps get to that in the course of this discussion. I was very lucky, but I think you do have to be lucky to make it in the media. You have to have that moment where a big break comes your way. And then a lot of it is down to you. That door has been opened for you. Do you walk through that door or do you not? And I was determined when I got that chance at 19 that I was going to take it and I was going to be absolutely the best I could be. And it probably meant that as a young person, I didn't enjoy my youth the way a lot of people do. I think I probably had to grow up quite quickly. It probably meant that my interests, maybe even before that, my interests were maybe a bit different in that regard. I was always interested in things like languages and politics and classical music, and maybe not your typical sort of young person's interests. And then going into the media at 19, I think, if anything, probably made me, even older in terms of how I acted. I mean, obviously I was only 19, and you can't change really the fact that you're 19, but I think I was always very determined to prove that I belonged in the business, because there was part of me who thought that at 19 I wouldn't be accepted by everyone.
So you were studying German at university, correct, weren't you, at the time? So did you continue your studies as well as working with the BBC, or did you drop your studies and just go full-time with the BBC?
Well, that's a really good question. And what happened was I initially started combining the two. I was actually nearing the end of my first year at Aberdeen University, and I started doing freelance stuff for the BBC. And then the idea was that I would go to Glasgow and work the summer when there was no football but other sports going on, and it would be a good sort of additional training ground to be in Glasgow, to be on the air every day doing the sports bulletins. And then I'd go back to university to do my second year. But what happened was, during the course of that summer, eventually it got to the stage where they said, we really like having you here. Would you consider coming full time? And that was a huge decision and a big dilemma, because I loved, and still do, love German language. And, I saw myself really becoming a translator or a teacher of languages, and maybe doing broadcasting on the side, because I thought, to be honest, that's the only way it can work. I didn't really think there were many jobs on a full-time basis as a commentator. So I did this for a while, but then the offer came. And when that offer came, I, again, was determined to grab it. And was it the right decision? Should I have stayed with my university studies and tried to work something else out? We'll never know. I'm a great believer that the path you took is the path that you took for a reason. And I've been lucky enough since then to have more than 3 decades on the air in various countries broadcasting football, which was my ultimate dream. So from that point of view, it probably was the right thing.
Yeah. So you mentioned you studied German at university, and you're obviously now fluent in German. Do you think it's a sort of an undervalued skill in terms of broadcasting, because not many people can do it in multiple languages?
I do. I'm a great believer in languages. I think they helped me as a young person become very sort of nimble and dexterous mentally, because a lot goes into learning a language. It doesn't just happen. You know, there's a lot of memorizing, listening, and a lot of it is solitary work. And, you know, that's been sort of throughout my life. Solitary work has been a big theme for me, whether it's been with languages or especially with broadcasting. It's my one regret, the two countries that I've lived in for most of my life, the UK and the USA, they're not really known for being countries that, you know, put a lot of emphasis on foreign languages. People are not natural, or I'm going to say not naturally good. I don't think it's a matter of not being naturally good. I think just because the focus is not there. And it's laziness too, because people like to speak English. People from other countries like to speak English. So it's not seen as particularly vital to know other languages. I also took the opposite view, and it started with the '74 World Cup, when I used to watch these pictures from West Germany, and they played East Germany in one of the games. We had two Germanys back then, one from the Western Bloc, one from the East. And I used to find it all fascinating. I wanted to know the geography of all these countries. Was really interested in the language aspect, and that sort of kicked on the interest in German for me. And of course, when we as a class all learned German a couple of years later, or started learning German, then, you know, I was all in. So I think it's a great skill, and I've actually taken a lot of the techniques from language learning into my preparation for broadcasting. The way I put everything out on a sheet and try to memorize it and color code. It's right from the same textbook. And I think most people who have learned the language will tell you, Chris, that they write things down. And I'm not sure nowadays if that's how it's taught with the younger generation. I honestly wouldn't know that so much, but I know that for my generation, just, you know, having I'll show you, you know, a book like this and just kind of, you know, scribbling things, writing things down, it does implant the important part of that in the memory. At least I've always found that.
You mentioned that you've lived in multiple countries. I know that we read up that you sort of invest in local culture almost, and you like to learn about it. How crucial do you think that is to making yourself feel comfortable and not feel homesick?
That's an interesting way to put it. I think it may be a factor. It may well be an important factor, because I first went to Germany as a young student when I was in my late teens. So this was between school and university. So this is before I got involved with BBC, but was obviously broadcasting. At that time, most of my thoughts were about German language. And I went to this tiny place in Germany, right on the border of the two Germanys, West and East. When I say on the border, 20 meters away from where I was living was the border between West and East Germany. So you could see the East German border guards with their binoculars on the other side looking over to the West. It was a bit creepy. You know, it was like something out of a spy novel. In a weird way, I found it and quite, certainly interesting, certainly fascinating. A little bit macabre too, because in a place where nobody spoke English, so I had to speak German every day and wanted to. But it made me determined to have the idea that wherever I went in my life, I wanted to sort of take on elements of that local culture and not be a foreigner abroad, but somebody who would be part of the community I was in. So when I got the chance to move to the Boston area, and I'm talking to you from the Boston area now, I've had a couple of spells here and live here again now. When I first arrived here in Boston, I wanted to know everything about Boston, and so I did a lot of reading in advance. And then I was a little bit of the sort of person who wanted to have knowledge constantly. I wanted to talk to local people, wanted to know what made them tick. And so I think that probably is part of it, is feeling part of it, and things that he or she perhaps doesn't know. So not just the obvious facts about a country that you could look up in a book, but sometimes obscure things that can bring home that, we're all one world, but we are all different in terms of our culture within that world. And, that will, I think, till the last day that I broadcast. That will always be part of who I am as a broadcaster, is trying to explain those differences and those things that frankly are really interesting and really worthwhile to explore.
Absolutely, yeah. Speaking of American, of course, you spent a substantial amount of time there, and you've covered some huge things whilst you've been there. What are your thoughts when people say you were essentially like the voice of football in America?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be as presumptuous as to call myself that. Because there've been others. There were others before me, and there've been others actually after me too. What I probably would say, if I were to analyse it, fairly, is that there was a time and a place when that might have been true for a particular generation. And I'm talking about the period between about 2004 and 2010. And I say that because you've got to go back in time and think about what the landscape was like TV-wise here in the USA for football. And at that point, there wasn't a lot of football coverage on TV here in the States. It was quite difficult to find. You could find it, but the one thing that we had on ESPN, where I was the lead commentator, was the Champions League. So that would go out in midweek, obviously, but it was during the day here in the States. And you guys in the UK will always think of the Champions League as I would too when I lived in the UK, as an evening event. But in the US, it's a daytime thing. So if you're on the West Coast, it's 11 o'clock in the morning or 11:45 in the morning when it kicks off, or did back then. And then on the East Coast, 2:45 in the afternoon. So it had a loyal audience, but what we discovered during that period was that younger people who were discovering the sport at that time, were running home from school to watch the games, to catch the second half, might have been at college or university, and were, skipping class, hopefully not too often, but getting out as early as possible so as to watch the games. Because at that time, the sport had a reputation amongst the older generation here in the USA for being somehow un-American. It wasn't a sport that older people had grown up with. They liked their baseball and their American football, basketball, etc. But younger people were more open to it. So I hear a lot now, especially on social media, from people who are perhaps in their late 20s, early 30s, who back then were the high school kids, the early college students, who will say to me that they discovered top level football through our broadcasts on ESPN. So, if that is the case, then I'm always very flattered to hear that. But as I said, to be fair, I think since I left, because I did leave the USA again in 2009, 2010, to go back to the UK to work for first ESPN UK and then BT Sport. And it's only in the last 3 years I've come back. Now, in between time, I was still heard on World Cups and Euros, working for ESPN and for Fox and other competitions too. But I wasn't working day in, day out in the US. And others, have followed and have done more work in the US than I have in the last decade. So, if people remember that time at all, then I'm always very grateful.
Well, there's particular moments obviously in the mid-noughties period, maybe headlined by Istanbul, of course, for yourself. How did you sort of approach trying to really push that across to the American audience? Because obviously you mentioned a lot of them say they were almost converted in a sense to the sport at that point. How seminal were moments, or other moments, if there's any, you can think of off the top of your head, how seminal were those, and how key did you feel it was to convey just how big that was?
That was, well, looking back, my favourite game, the Champions League final in 2005 in Istanbul. What I wanted to do with that final was really ram home to a wider public. And by the way, it didn't just go out in the US. I should also say it went out to many other parts of the world. Yeah, because ESPN had rights in Africa, in Middle East, in Australia, New Zealand, Latin America, you name it. But for the American audience, I really thought this was a great chance to tell a few different stories at the same time. One was the story of the venue, Istanbul, which is one of my favorite cities. I've been lucky enough to be there on many occasions, and I just think it's an absolute treasure trove for anybody who goes there on so many levels. So I was really delighted I would get to tell that story. And it's funny, when I listened back, and I did listen back the other day for the first time in a long time to that broadcast, because I was doing a different broadcast specifically about that game. And The audio is a little bit kind of less than perfect. It's got
Yeah.
that sort of almost telephone line sound, which lends a little bit of an exotic air to it. The picture was a bit grainier than we might expect now, which again sort of I see as a plus looking back, because it makes it look like an important piece of history. But Istanbul was at the heart of that, and wanting to tell people about Istanbul and where we were, because most Americans didn't know very much at all about Istanbul, certainly not sports fans at that time. So the idea of a big event in Istanbul, that was immediately, of course, very appealing. Then you had, in a funny kind of way, and it's difficult to nowadays imagine that this was the case then, but you actually had a bit of a David against Goliath final. Now, Liverpool were the underdogs. I mean, they were huge underdogs going into that final. Milan then were the class of Europe. I mean, Milan were who everybody wanted to be. Again, it's funny talking now, you would sort of think, was that really the case? Yeah, it was. Liverpool was sort of a ragtag and bobtail team, that particular edition of Liverpool. And Milan had done us all before. And I think most people expected them to win handily. So that was the other thing I wanted to get across in that game was, yeah, Liverpool are the underdogs, but of course they do have this incredible European history. And I'd spent a lot of time in the previous broadcasts leading up to it, especially the games at Anfield, talking about how special Liverpool were in Europe. Because to my generation, I was born in the late 60s, I grew up watching the great Liverpool teams of the 70s and the 80s when they were the class of Europe. So in many respects, for me as a broadcaster, it was sort of compartmentalizing each facet of my life and trying to sort of put that into context for a new audience, and with this amazing backdrop. And the other thing I should say about Istanbul is we arrived 5 days before that final, because ESPN were a bit, I think, ahead of their time in comparison with British broadcasters who used to just show the final and it was just a one-off game and it didn't really matter where it was. We were in Istanbul, as I said, almost a week before, and we were doing our show every day with the Blue Mosque in the background and trying to bring home to the viewer how special, how different this place is, with the call to prayer happening in the middle of our shows from time to time. So that whole experience was special. And I do believe that is the game that really had the effect of awakening a generation in the USA. It might have happened sort of, on the back of it. It might not have been, oh yeah, I'm going to watch this game and see what happens. I think it was as word got out after it, and ESPN replayed the game into the night on several of its channels. And a lot of people perhaps only saw it, after the fact in the evening when they got home from work, because it was an afternoon affair, as I said earlier, in the USA. But I think it did have that effect. And I think one of the reasons why Liverpool have as many fans as they do in the USA is because of that final, because a lot of people who were looking for a team to adopt saw this, and again, strange to say it now, ultimate underdog team in Liverpool, saw how they won it, having been 3-0 down, came back to 3-3 and then won on penalties. They saw how they did it and immediately became Liverpool fans. So the dots were all sort of joined.
Yeah, it all just fell together.
Yeah.
One thing I want to link with that is obviously, and just listening to the way you speak about it, is sort of like a romance for the game, like romanticizing the sport. And it's something I know you're very big on. It's something I read about again before the interview. I just want to talk to you about that sort of thing, like the whole romanticism of the sport and how you feel that's so important to really embracing it.
Yeah, I think romance is something that is in us if we are football fans, which we are. And, at some point in our lives as youngsters, there was something about the sport that we fell in love with. It wasn't just a kind of all right, I can sort of take it or leave it kind of thing, or I'll watch this game. There was something that one moment, one game, one team, might have been something that our fathers introduced to us. Who knows? It could be all of those things, or it could just be one of them. But I do think romance is at the very heart of it. And I take it even further. One of my great hobbies when I'm in Germany nowadays is to watch lower division football. And there is so much romance to be found there, sometimes even more romance than at the highest levels. And the romance can simply be the same group of people who have gone to a game together for 40 years. And there they are in their same spots watching their team. Their team might be terrible. They might be the worst team in the league, but they go to every game. They go with their pals. And that to me is romance. Romance could be, a local player. As an Aberdonian, watching Aberdeen win the Cup Winners' Cup final in 1983 against Real Madrid, no less, and for the winning goal in extra time to be scored by a guy from just up the road, a local boy from Aberdeen, John Hewitt, that is romance. So, I mean, it's everywhere. We can find it wherever we want to find it. That's the great thing about it. What you find romantic, somebody else might not, but it's personal to you, and that is romance. And so, when I first came to the USA, one of my jobs, well, I was the press officer for the World Cup Organizing Committee for a spell when I first came here. And one of the things I used to try to impress upon Americans was that they were sort of missing out on this worldwide romantic conversation, because I, as a Scot, could bump into, randomly a Hungarian or a Brazilian or, you name your nationality. And we would have something to talk about based on football. There would be some shared knowledge or experience that we could draw upon. And until that point, and it's changed now because Americans are a lot more knowledgeable about football these days. But up until that point in the USA, there wasn't that frame of reference. So it's romance, it's global, it's shared, it's community. And sometimes the community doesn't have to be just, within our own circle. The community can be pretty extensive.
Do you feel like that's changing a bit in the modern age, though, in the technology age? Do you feel like that's almost being lost a little?
Well, I hope not. I mean, I take your point. I think that there has been a tendency in recent years to focus on the very biggest and the best. But I think there are still people who look out for, quirky things here and there that they can find romantic. I don't belong to this organization, but there is an organization called Groundhoppers. And I've always found them really pretty interesting, intriguing, because basically it's a group of people who just, and now they have apps and everything, so they share the knowledge, but they just love going to football in different venues in different cities. And it used to be that it was very impromptu, but now there's actually an app. So you can, if you find yourself, say, in, Zurich in Switzerland on a Saturday, you can go to the Groundhopper app and you can find out where the Groundhoppers are all meeting. And these will be people, like you, who just love football, want to go to a game, want to do it with like-minded people, and on we go from there. Now, I realize that's probably the minority, that most people are enticed by all the money and all the big clubs. But, that can be romantic too, of course. Absolutely, it can be. You can find romance at Bayern, you can find romance at Manchester City, you could find romance everywhere. Even the richest and the most successful in any country can provide romance. But I always say to people, if you can, just dig a little bit deeper, because if you really want to find the soul of the game, I firmly believe it is still to be found in the smaller communities and further down the divisions.
Yeah, well, bringing it back to sort of the cultural element. So obviously you've got a family of your own. How did you feel like moving back and forth from USA to UK to wherever you've been? How do you feel that they cope with that? And do you think that it would have been better to stay in one place, or do you think it's really helped them develop as people?
Well, I should say first of all that I have a family, but I have a wife, but no kids. Yeah. So I have parents who are still in the UK and a sister, but I don't have kids. So had I had children, the decisions that we made might have been very different. But the decisions that we made or have made throughout our married lives, and we've been married, Beth and I have been married now for a long time.
It's wonderful to hear, though.
24 years. So, we've been married a long time. And my life has always been one of bouncing around and traveling here, traveling to a game. So that's sort of gone with the territory. Now, it wasn't necessarily our life plan in 2009 to return to the UK. That was an opportunity that came up, and I thought it was a really interesting one at the time, and one that would be wonderful to take on. In fact, I thought I would regret it if I didn't. having lost the Champions League rights, it was an opportunity to get back broadcasting in the UK. Probably felt I had a bit of unfinished business in the UK because I'd left relatively young after being given my start at BBC. So it wouldn't be for everybody to be moving, to be shunting back and forth. I do think that it's funny, even though I'm Scottish and proudly so, and obviously I've worked in the UK market a lot. I probably would tell you that home is here because I've spent most of my adult life here. From the early 90s until now, with the exception of that spell when I was back in the UK, which really was 8 years. It was 7 living in London, but 1 year back and forth between the two. So not sure if that 1 year counts or not. I think everybody's got to make their own decision on that. But I do think that travel broadens the mind. It changes you. There's no doubt. If you were to talk to my wife, she would tell you that the 7 years that she spent in London changed her, quite radically. She had only ever lived in the USA prior to that. She'd obviously had exposure to a lot of other countries through trips, through visits. But being in London for 7 years changed her perspective on so many different things. And I think it also had that same effect on me when I first moved to the USA and the times when I've been in Germany. And even now, when I travel as much as I have done, although not at the moment during lockdown for obvious reasons.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But all I can say is that for me, it has worked. And I think I'm the sort of person who thrives on that different environment and those new challenges within a different environment every so often.
Yeah. So one thing I was particularly interested in, I don't play the game myself, but FIFA is something that we wanted to discuss with you. Because, how does it work? It's a very weird thing. I'm interested to know how the sort of commentary works in it.
Well, without giving away too many of the secrets of how it all does work, what I can tell you is that I've been one of the commentators on FIFA now the last couple of years. And what we do is we simply go into a studio and we record, a lot of material, which obviously can be used for different facets of the game. And the idea is that the producer comes in fully armed with everything that he needs. And it's a matter then of me and also Lee Dixon, who's my commentary partner on it. It's a matter of us delivering something that we would say organically in a game, multiplied probably by 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, depending on the need. So just imagine, a free kick just outside the box. Imagine what a commentator, what I might say, or any other commentator might say organically. Free kick is taken and it just almost shaves the post, just goes wide. There are different ways you can express that. And so what we do is we come up with something that sounds like us, something that we would say as far as possible. Occasionally we go even further than that because we want to give as many examples as possible so that the person playing the game doesn't hear the same lines over and over. I think there's probably a danger during the lockdown with people playing the game as much as they are, that they are going to be a bit fed up of, oh, you said that line 2 minutes ago, why are you saying it again? Of course, I don't control what I say. I always say, well, I said it once. I only used that line once. But that is essentially how it works. And then a lot of the other things that we do on the game are repetition of names. So, if you think about it, a big chunk of commentary on TV or on FIFA is player A passing to player B. It's as simple as that. Ederson, Salah, so changing the inflection of that so that it doesn't all sound boring and repetitive is part of the skill of it. And of course, we do the inflections to reflect different outcomes in a game, so that if Salah, for example, is just passing, well, it's going to be a nondescript sort of Salah. If Salah is in a dangerous position and maybe about to do something exciting, then it might be a bit more like Salah, And then if he's in position to score, then obviously I'm going to be giving it the big licks and something like Salah, So it's all about finding the right moment in the game for that particular emphasis or inflection. And it is interesting. People often say to me, oh, what is it, just a couple of days in a studio? And I go, well, try 20 to 25. Not all at once, I should say.
Yeah, of course, yeah. But
yeah, not consecutively, but we do them in little blocks usually sort of 3-4 days at a time, and then take a break from it, and then come back and pick it up again, and it's done over a number of months.
It's got to be quite a different approach, though, I'd imagine, to kind of invoke the kind of emotional sort of side of it from your own voice, because it's not the same as obviously commentating on an actual game. So how do you sort of get yourself into the mindset for that sort of same, try to translate that same emotion across?
Well, I use the same techniques that I use when doing a game, as we call off-tube. Now, you know, a lot of the games that you watch on your TVs nowadays, you might not know it, but the commentator isn't always at the ground. Yeah. The commentator is sometimes in a studio commentating. So I've done a lot of that down the years as well. So when I'm in a studio and not at the ground, I always make a point of cranking up the volume of the crowd noise to the maximum. And I always actually tell ex-players who I work with who are new to it, I always say, if you really want to sound the best that you're going to sound, learn how to fight the crowd. So turn it up loudly, and it actually has the remarkable effect of putting you inside the stadium. So with the game, with the video game, I do the same thing. So now obviously I'm not commentating directly on a game, but I do make sure that I have a crowd track in my ear that I turn up to the maximum and fight, so that immediately gives me a different tone to my voice. You know, you could probably imagine it if suddenly, you know, if I were wearing headphones and I'm fighting a crowd track, I'm going to be talking a bit more like that than I am, you know, sort of more conversational level. So that helps, first of all. What has also helped me is the fact that I've been so lucky down the years to be at most of these venues. So, you know, I can draw upon a lot of the material that I just luckily have in my head, you know, whether it's Stamford Bridge or whether it's the Allianz Arena in Munich, whether it's the Signal Iduna Park in Dortmund. I've been to these places as a commentator, so I can picture them. I know how you get to the stadium. I know what the atmosphere is like around the venues. And it's amazing how much of that I just use in some of these introductions. You know, the producer will say to me, yeah, give us a little introduction about Stamford Bridge, you know, maybe just talk a bit about what it's like on a match day. Now, if I'd never been there, I'd have trouble with that. But obviously I can picture it in my mind, you know, and I take myself back to my own walks around that West London neighbourhood when I get ready to do those introductions. Speaking
of grounds, you know, you visited, you know, however many grounds over the years. Have you got any particularly, like, a top 5 that you really enjoy visiting or being there on match days for?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Haz, in the sense that if you ask me this again tomorrow, I might give you sort of
have a different answer,
different ones, because there's so many. But just off the top of my head, we'll maybe go in reverse order. My favourite Scottish ground is actually Tynecastle, the home of Hearts. And a lot of people say, well, why is it better than Celtic Park? I'll say, well, it's different. What I like about Tynecastle is it is an old-fashioned ground right in the neighbourhood, right in the middle of Gorgie, with the tenements, you know, surrounding it. You can look into the stadium, or at least you used to be able to, from some of the tenements. You know, right behind the one of the stands behind the goals, and it just oozes passion. And I think it's the best atmosphere for a game in Scotland. It's always appealed to me. Always been a big Edinburgh fan. So Tynecastle would have to be on my list for sentimental reasons. I would also mention, obviously, Germany has got to figure pretty prominently.
Of course,
in the list, yeah. I'd have to mention the Rhein-Energiestadion, the home of Köln, which is a special place for me. That's my adopted German team and has been for some time. And it's the city in Germany I spend most time in when I'm there. And we're talking about a public that just absolutely loves its club. They haven't had a great deal of success in recent years.
It's been very rough for them.
Yeah, yo-yo up and down.
Yeah, absolutely.
Relegations and promotions. But there's a real warm-hearted quality to people in Köln. And it comes through when anybody visits that stadium, they all say the same thing. And the anthem they play, which is actually derived from the Scottish song by Runrig Loch Lomond, but with German words, that's consistently voted the best anthem of any club in Germany, and it all goes to the warm-hearted nature of that. In England, my favourite ground is actually Selhurst Park.
A lot of people say this. A hell of a lot of people say that.
Yeah, it just purely for atmosphere. It's old school. you can tell I quite like old school when it comes to grounds, and that just embodies all of that. I'm not a Palace fan or anything. I just have always enjoyed my trips there, and I think it stands out as something a little bit different, and certainly not sanitized or anything of that nature. So that would have to be on my list. Number 2, I'm going to go back to Germany and the Dortmund Stadium, the Signal Iduna Park. That's the sponsor's name, the Westfalenstadion, as the locals still call it. That is just unlike anywhere else. And it's probably, if you were to give me the chance to do my last commentary somewhere, that's probably the ground I would choose. I've been there many times, and I say to every football fan, if you do get the chance, just go. Just go and watch a game there, preferably from the Südtribüne, the yellow wall behind the goal. It is really, a one-off, and it doesn't matter what game you go to. Go to any game you can get to go to. And number 1, and this might surprise a little bit, but number 1 is a ground I visited back in 2005, and that is La Bombonera in Buenos Aires, which is the home of Boca Juniors. It's not a work of art in terms of the stadium, but there's just something about it. And I used that word soul earlier. You can feel the soul in La Bombonera. Yeah, it means the chocolate box.
Looking at images. Yeah, even just looking at images, it looks terrifying, if I'm honest.
Terrifying is a good word. They call it the chocolate box. And it is a sort of chocolate box of different flavors and emotions. And it is just, again, a bit like Dortmund, unlike anything that you'll ever experience. And Boca see themselves in Argentina as kind of the people's team, the team of the working classes in Argentina. And the other great thing about it is and they're quite famous for this and proud of this, they have the best steak sandwiches you will ever have the privilege of trying before a game. And, steak in Argentina is the best in the world, and Boca are rightly proud of their steak sandwiches.
Well, there we go. So, obviously, you've been to a lot of grounds in a lot of countries, but what we'll say is there's competitions which certainly have a different feel. So, what is your favourite competition, first to visit and secondly to commentate in?
Favourite competition. I think my favourite competition, not necessarily as a commentator, but my favourite competition is actually the Cup in Germany. In England, most people talk about the FA Cup and the romance of it. Because of my German language influence as a youngster, I fell in love early on with the DFB Pokal, as it's called, the German Cup. And I think it's greatly underrated in the English-speaking world in terms of, to use that word again, how romantic it is. Because I think it embodies romance. It is still a very meaningful competition. It attracts huge crowds, hasn't had the problems at all that the FA Cup has had, and it's taken seriously by everybody. So you will not see coaches putting reserve teams out in the DFB Pokal at all. And that one goes all the way back to listening to games on the radio in German from Aberdeen. We used to get the signal right across the North Sea from Hamburg all the way up to Aberdeen, and I was grateful for that. So I was able to listen to a lot of games as a youngster. And I have been able to broadcast it, but not as often as enjoying it simply as a fan. So I think that would have to go down as my favourite competition as a fan. As a broadcaster, it would be difficult for me not to say the Champions League, because that's the competition that probably for me has been the biggest I have broadcast on a sort of a year-to-year basis. Yes, I've done World Cups, and they are incredible too, but the Champions League became so much part of who I am when I was doing it year in, year out, and then got to revisit it again when I was back in the UK with BT Sport. So it's it is special. And of course, on FIFA nowadays too, to be the voice of the Champions League, it's sort of all come back, the memories of those epic games back in 2005, 2006, etc. So yeah, I think I'd have to say the Champions League as a broadcaster.
Yeah.
Is there any particular games in your mind from the Champions League in the last, however many years that you really fondly remember? Obviously, we mentioned Istanbul, but is there any other ones that really stick out as well?
Yeah, I mean, we could go down the list of great finals. The one in Moscow stands out too, when Manchester United beat Chelsea on penalties. And I think we looked at the clock. It was something like 20 past 1 in the morning most of the time when that finished. And that was an absolute epic. What else have we had? We've had Liverpool, Chelsea games. We've had, I'm trying to think some of the other final, Barcelona, Manchester United in the final 2009, when I believe Messi really announced himself to a wider public. I'd been covering Messi a lot doing the Spanish League every week for ESPN, but I detected in the UK at that time, people weren't totally convinced, or they didn't really know enough about Messi. This was 11 years ago. They knew he was good, but they weren't watching him week in, week out. And Manchester United went into that final as the bookies' favourites in England. They thought, they're going to be too good for Barcelona. They can't defend. But I was adamant Barcelona were going to win that final in Rome, and they did. And of course, Messi scored. And I think that was the turning point, if there was one, in terms of how he was. It was never that people in England thought he was terrible. I think it was just the fact that people weren't watching other football as much in 2009, and he didn't play in England. And here he was, the best player in the world, as he was to become, if he wasn't already at that point. And he did outshine Ronaldo in that head-to-head, if you like, between the two of them when they were on the pitch at the same time. So, those ones. And then, countless other ones like Deportivo coming back to knock out
Super
Milan.
Depor, Super Depor.
I'll never forget that game when everybody had written them off and they just absolutely ran riot in the second leg of that game. Also, as a Scot, there were a couple of very memorable Celtic Manchester United's encounters during that period. One, I remember Celtic beating United, which a lot of people thought was well nigh impossible.
Nakamura score, is that the one?
Nakamura, yeah. Nakamura.
Yes, come on, good knowledge.
Yeah, good memory.
So, onto your broadcasting stuff. What advice would you give to new commentators coming through, and what do you think are the absolute fundamentals of it?
Okay, so the advice, first of all, I would say get yourself on tape. That's really important. So have material of your work on tape and be in a position to critically analyze it. So even if that is what I did, going to a local game and putting your voice on tape and listening back to see how it sounds. I do think that's really important. Now, the difference between then and now is the opportunities are greater for younger broadcasters in the sense that you can present yourself to a club. Most of the clubs have club TV. You can do some work for club TV and learn by doing. So however you learn by doing, whether it's club TV, hospital radio, or your own tapes, you have to do that first of all. I think the other thing that's really important is to work on the voice. So you get to the certain point where you realize that it's not just shouting, it's actually very controlled what you're doing. It's controlled speaking, it's modulating. And so you sort of work on your pitch the way, and it sounds strange, but the way a singer might work on his or her pitch. And I do that even constantly. Before a game, I always make sure that I know what my high note is for the day and I know what my low note is for the day. It can actually change depending on how much you've been using your voice or abusing your voice. But the one thing you don't want to do is go into a game and try to hit a note that you can't reach, because that's not going to sound very good. And the same at the low end as well. So there are, and again, you've probably never heard anybody say this before, but I'm of the firm belief that there are similarities with singing in terms of commentating. And if you think about a good commentary, it does sound as though it sings a little bit. There's a rhythm, there's a syncopation, there are kind of notes there, up and down and across, and it should have those qualities. But what I would say is that, believe in yourself, because if you don't, nobody else is going to. Believe in yourself, be determined, and, give it a go. But realize too at the same time that you're going to face rejection. We all have, I have. We all are going to have doors slammed in our faces. The trick is to not be down about that, to pick yourself up and realize that, it's a bit like trying to realize a dream. You may not be able to realize that dream, but you won't know unless you give it your all. So that would be the main advice. The fundamentals for me are, as I said, working really hard, realizing that it's a job. It's not an ego trip. Not that I would think anybody who's serious about it would ever go down that road, but it's a job of digging, of working really hard on your own. I mean, most of the work I do is solitary, and it's lonely. You know, you're sort of sitting sometimes for 8 hours trying to dig out 2 or 3 factoids that might be useful for a commentary 3 weeks down the line. But it has to be done. It's part of the essential process in terms of finding these little things. So it's all these things rolled together. It's vocal discipline, it's learning how to use your voice, and that can take time. And I think time is also an important thing too, because, you know, I'm 53 now, and there are things that, you know, I've learned in the last year that I wish I had known, you know, 20, 30 years ago. But the learning process is a delightful one, and it's one we should all embrace. And so at the same time, we want to be ambitious, but we want to take our time, and we want to enjoy the moment and live that moment, and, you know, keep hopefully getting better, but realize that it's a long process. You know, Rome wasn't built in a day, to use that old expression. And we keep learning, and hopefully we keep improving.
One thing I wanted to sort of add on to that is, especially in the sort of modern age where you obviously got social media and fans that obviously attack pretty much anything and everything if they don't like something. And obviously the big one with media teams is bias, and a lot of people will claim, you know, X pundit is biased, this commentator is biased. How do you deal with those sorts of, I guess you could say they're almost like accusations. What's your thoughts on that, and how did you sort of go around dealing with that?
I think nowadays, as a commentator, if you're on social media, you have to have thick skin, and you have to realize that most of the people who will tell you that you are biased, funnily enough, are actually extremely partisan people themselves. So if you think about it, the idea that somebody who is a huge fan of a particular club is the arbiter of whether a commentator whose job it is to be unbiased, as to whether that commentator is partial or not, is a bit ridiculous. But what I can say, and I can say this on behalf of every commentator out there, it's far more important for all of us that the production is smooth, that our commentary is smooth, that we didn't make any major gaffes. Those things are far more important to us than who wins or loses the game. And I can even extend that to my team, Aberdeen. You know, I'm an unabashed Aberdeen supporter. I'm from the city. They are my team. I've commentated on them many times. But when I'm commentating on them, I cease to become a fan of the club, because my team that day is not Aberdeen. My team is the production team I'm with, my director, my producer, the camera people, the sound men, my co-commentator, everybody who's in the team. We want our production to be flawless. And so that goes way beyond, you know, you forget about who's actually playing in the game. And it's only later, you know, I could be watching Aberdeen as a fan a week from that point, and view it totally differently, because then I'm a fan. But it's like flicking a switch. You flick a switch and, no, I'm a commentator today, and it doesn't matter to me who wins this game. And that is an essential part of it. And I can say that is true of every commentator. It's far more important for us that the production is right than who wins or loses a game. And, you know, we didn't get into the business to be professional fans. We got into the business because we love football. And that's what I will tell you too. As much as I do love Aberdeen, and as much as I'm, you know, delighted when Scotland win anything, which is not very often nowadays, it's far more important for me to love football. And that is what I love, is the sport in its many different shapes and sizes. I mentioned earlier, going to watch 4th and 5th division games in Germany. That is what I love more than being absolutely devoted to one club. And I think you'll find most commentators are the same.
You've seen obviously a lot of eras in that point as well, you know, between the start of your career to this point. And then another common thing that happens a lot now is people compare eras. They'll compare, you know, a player from this point to a player from the 70s, 80s, 90s. How do you feel about that? Do you think it's a fair comparison to make, given how different the game is now, how different players are now? You know, players are almost like scientific robots at this point compared to, you know, the players of the 90s, the 80s, and, you know, before that. So how do you feel that, is it, you know, feasible to make such comparisons at this point?
I don't think you can, because, as you've outlined, the game is so different. You know, the game nowadays is an athletic, scientific, tactical sport in a way it wasn't when I first started watching it in the early 1970s. And if you were to go back and watch, say, the '74 World Cup, you would see, players of different builds. You would see players who don't look like athletes at all. My great hero from that World Cup, Gerd Müller, didn't look at all like an athlete. He was just a finisher, pure finisher, pure poacher, but the best, the prince of poachers. So I think it probably is futile to compare and contrast. I think it's far better to highlight players from every era, because you could only be as good as you had to be in that era, So that's really the only fair comparison. To sort of say, okay, well, what would Müller be like nowadays? Well, I have every reason to believe that somebody like Müller, as gifted as he was, would have adapted to the era that he played in if it were possible to put him in a time machine and have him play nowadays. Sadly, he's no longer with us. So I think, we have to judge every football era on its merits at that time. And I think it's legitimate if somebody says, I preferred football in the 80s. That's okay. That's a point of view, because football was different in the 80s. If you look at some of the games in England in the 80s, the pitches were, an abomination compared to what you see nowadays.
Yeah, of course.
Perfect grass across the Premier League. You didn't have that back then, but players adapted to what was in place. And they used to sometimes play every couple of days, and you didn't have, vast squads, and players got injured more often, or long-term injuries anyway were picked up as a result of that, which certainly wasn't a good thing. But I'm more inclined just to say that, I feel lucky to have watched football in a couple of different eras, or, probably more than that now. And, I got great joy from Johan Cruyff in the 70s, from Diego Maradona in the 1980s, from Ronaldo when he was the best player in the world, the Brazilian Ronaldo, from him to the other Ronaldo, to Messi, to you name them. They were all greats for a reason. And they were, greats of their time. And it is the wonderful thing about the sport. We can compare and contrast. We can go back to Stanley Matthews and how great he was. We can go back to the 1920s and the Wembley Wizards and how amazing they were at the time. Every era is like that. And I'll guarantee if we have this conversation again in 30 years from now, we'll be looking back 2020 and thinking, oh, that was, things weren't as scientific and athletic as they are now. So everything changes.
Of course, even though we see it as forward as possible at this point, it's going to change massively. It's already starting to change, the implementation of VAR and things like that. It's changing, at such a rapid pace. It's quite terrifying, if anything. But I think that's a perfect place to wrap it up as well. It's been an absolute pleasure, Derek. I don't even know.
Likewise, pleasure's all mine. Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me, and I hope it's helpful.
I've learned a hell of a lot. No, absolutely. We both definitely learned a hell of a lot. I hope everybody that tunes into this when it comes out learns a hell of a lot from you as well. You've really shone light on some fantastic stuff. And again, thank you. Really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm not sure when this will go out, but if we haven't already, hit the subscribe button. That'd be fantastic for Winning Mentality. And Derek, anything else you'd like to say there?
No, just let me know if I can help promote it and get the word out about it. The last thing I would say would be probably to repeat what I said earlier: believe in yourself. Have self-belief. You can be confident without being arrogant, and do it. Go out there and do it rather than just thinking one day you might do it. And as I say, if you have that self-belief, you can make it.
Perfect. And Haas.
Perfect words for obviously a trying time. So again, thank you, Derek. Really appreciate that. And as always, guys, we'll see you on the next one.
Take care.